All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's public discussion on the FDA and CPAT's clinical outcomes assessment effort for ALS. My name is Elio Peraza. I am the ALS program coordinator here at NINDS, and I'd like to welcome you to our first, what we like to call the Forum for People with Lived Experience, or PWLE. Just to give you a little more context, for AMP ALS, we want to connect with people with lived experience, and we often do that through our committees and through different working groups. But occasionally we like to tap into a broader audience, such as this group, to not only present significant updates and progress that has been made, but also to get your feedback and opinions and answer any questions that you may have about what's going on within the AMP-ALS project. So this forum is essentially a large focus group comprised of about 120 people with lived experience. And this is the first time that we are convening this group, as normally we tend to have our monthly meeting with the smaller, more active working group at this time. So we're going to continue to convene this working group, this forum periodically, to continue relaying important updates and seeking your input. A few housekeeping notes. We have enabled the Q&A functionality as well as chat functionality. Please place any questions that you want answered by the panelists in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And as always, we thank you in advance for keeping all the questions and the conversations within the topics of the discussion for this conversation. The presentation is being recorded. We will not post it publicly. What we'll do is, if anyone is interested, please reach out to us and we would be happy to share the recording with you and also ensure that you are on our list of the PWLE forum. We also have several interested program staff from NINDS that are listening in on this discussion, but as we want to focus this time and this call on you, those staff will have a more passive role this time around and will not be serving as panelists. And I'll now hand it off to Colin Hovinga. Colin is the Vice President of Rare and Orphan Disease Programs at the Critical Path Institute, and he will introduce our panelists. Colin?
Yeah, go ahead. And I want to switch to the next slide. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone for attending today. This is an exciting opportunity for us to start sharing some of the work that's being done within Critical Path Institute in conjunction with members of the Food and Drug Administration. We really value the patient community and the persons with lived experience community, as they've really pointed to the problem that this work is beginning to address, which is we need new clinical outcome assessments. We need to really discuss multiple domains that impact the lives of persons impacted by ALS. And so this really is an initial step to address this. And the speakers today will discuss the work and where this work will be progressing over the coming months to years, potentially. I want to thank everyone that's involved in participating with this effort today. And I will start with introductions of our speakers, and then I'll hand it off to Teresa Bracchio. For our speakers, Michelle Campbell, she's the Associate Director for Offices of Neuroscience in CEDAR, and Cheryl Kuhn, who's Vice President for Clinical Outcome Assessments at Critical Path Institute. Teresa, I will allow her to go ahead and give generalities to these individuals, but I'm going to pass the mic to Teresa Bracchio, who's Director of Neuroscience at CEDAR at FDA, for opening remarks. And I really want to welcome everyone to this presentation. Teresa?
I think I'm unmuted now, right? All right. So I also would like to welcome everyone to today's presentation. I think it was last summer or so when we first met with the Clinical Outcome Assessment Working Group within the AMP for ALS and presented the FDA's roadmap for developing a fit-for-purpose, patient-focused COA. As part of that roadmap, the initial steps are to understand the disease and to conceptualize the clinical benefits and risks. And that includes identifying what the concepts of interest are and identifying a context of use for a clinical trial. On those calls, when we initially discussed this roadmap, we did hear from the community represented on those calls that there has been a lot of work that's been done already and a lot of accumulated knowledge on understanding the disease and concepts of interest in ALS. And we also heard concerns that working on these initial steps could be taking a step backward or be redundant with work that was already done. However, through those discussions, there was also a general agreement that a landscape analysis of the published literature of existing scales would be useful to establish a common baseline for discussions of the disease and assessment of the instruments, and also to help identify the gaps that need to be filled with development of instruments. So as this needed to be a focused and systematic review of the published literature and existing scales, and speed was of the essence, CPR&D contracted with a group who could do this work rapidly. And today you will hear the initial outcomes of this work. This work will provide a critical base of knowledge that will inform many discussions to come. And the most important thing to note for today is that this is the start of a conversation, and the conversation will be ongoing. Input from people with lived experience will be essential to move this work forward, and we need your input, and we know that you won't be shy in sharing it. So please provide your input, in the Q&A section that ends this call, and there will be an email address provided at the end of the call that you can provide your comments through email, and we look forward to hearing from you. With that, I think we can pass it over. I believe, Dr. Campbell, are you our first presenter?
I am Dr. Bracchio, and thank you so much for your remarks and providing, kind of setting up our conversation for today. As Colin said, I'm Michelle Campbell, and I'm the Associate Director for Stakeholder Engagement and Clinical Outcomes in the Office of Neuroscience in CEDAR. And I really want to spend the next few minutes kind of explaining what patient-focused drug development is, and how we use that at the FDA to make regulatory decisions. So next slide, please. So I think many of you have heard and been a part of, next slide, please, have been aware of our patient-focused drug development meetings that have occurred over the last decade plus at the FDA. And these meetings were really started back in 2012 to really help inform the FDA on the patient lived experience. And so what we've learned from the plethora of meetings that we have hosted ourselves, as well as the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, is that patients are uniquely positioned to inform regulatory understandings of the burden of disease, and what is available or not available for current treatments. Patients are the experts in what it is like to live with their condition, and that often the chief complaint that a patient may have may not actually be factored into drug development plans. Next slide. And so we do have a systematic, broader definition of what is patient-focused drug development that has emerged in the last decade. And it is really this systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, their perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into medical product development. And that includes the drugs that CEDAR regulates. Next slide. I also think we've heard the term patient experience data. And this came out of 21st Century Cures, and as well as FDAR in 2017. And it's a very broad term. It's a big umbrella term, and refers to data that's collected by any persons and are intended to provide information about patients' experiences with their disease and condition. Next slide, please. And so to really hone it down into what is really patient experience data, it is such a broad term. It ranges from our patient listening sessions that we host at the FDA, our patient drug development meeting program, the use of clinical outcome assessments, patient preference studies, patients' thoughts on benefit and risk, and thoughts on clinical meaningfulness are just some examples of what patient experience data is. Next slide. And so we know that patient experience data can be used across the life cycle of drug development. And you will see here on the slide where there could be key areas of input from patients throughout the drug development program. And as you know, we often talk about the understanding of natural history that can only come from patients and their lived experience. The supported development of trial endpoints, and we are going to be focusing on clinical outcome assessments today. We know that patients are critically important in the understanding of what is clinically meaningful to them and what kind of treatments they would expect and what would meaningful treatment look like, as well as understandings of the benefit-risk balance and is that acceptable for them. And so it is important to note that patient-focused drug development is really across the entire spectrum of drug development. And there are opportunities to make sure that we are incorporating the patient's lived experience. Next slide. And so this is important because we know solely, as I've said, that understanding disease impacts can only come from patients and their loved ones and that lived experience. We need to know how well do our most commonly studied endpoints in trials for the disease align with outcomes in those experiences. So for example, is there a subpopulation of patients that have a slightly different experience? And we need to make sure we can capture that in a rigorous way. Are we conducting trials in a given disease that maybe we're excluding patients who want to enroll? And if so, how can that be addressed? Can we possibly address that? And are there currently and commonly used clinical trial protocols that are intolerable or unworkable because of the participation and the expectations of what needs to be conducted in the trial? And if so, is there opportunities to work with that and be able to increase enrollments? Next slide. So we are going to focus on our conversation today on clinical outcomes assessments, which are used to support clinical trial endpoints. So it is important to know that a clinical outcome assessment is not actually the trial endpoint. It is the mechanism to collect that data that will then be used to support the trial endpoints. And so in efficacy trial endpoints, we need to be able to demonstrate clinical benefit, which is an improvement in how a patient feels, functions, and survives. Next slide. There are 4 types of clinical outcome assessments that we will be focusing on or we have defined in the BEST glossary. And the BEST glossary is a joint effort between FDA and NIH to pull together common terms that are used in drug development and research. And so we're all aligned in a base understanding of what these terms means. And so a clinical outcome assessment, or COA, is an assessment of a specific clinical outcome that can be made through a report by a clinician, either a patient, a non-clinician observer, or through performance-based measures. And these are the 4 types. Next slide. It's also important to know that when we are looking at clinical benefit, you will often hear us talk about, is what we're measuring clinically meaningful? And so really quickly, I wanted to try to give a beginning conversation, and we can have many more conversations on this in the future, on what are things that may not have what clinical meaningfulness and what are examples that are. And so we know that some clinician report exams may not provide clinical meaningfulness, as is if we see changes perhaps in reflexes, how does that actually impact the patient in terms of their function? And so the function is the aspect that we would want to make sure we're measuring. Changes in symptoms, and we hear that from patients in some groups where they say, you know, I'm hearing that this is changing, but it's not impacting my day-to-day. And so that's important to know. What we do know can provide clinically meaningful information includes numbness in hands that interferes with your ability to button your clothes, weakness in hands that interfere with ability to hold spoon and being able to eat, and also not be able to carry groceries. And these are just some examples to show how do we translate the information that's being collected and making sure we're capturing clinically meaningful aspects of the patients, as well as making sure we'll be able to support a clinical benefit finding. Next slide. So when we look at clinical outcome assessments, we need our clinical outcome assessments to be fit for purpose. And this is a statement of conclusion that the level of validation associated with the COA is supported for its proposed context of use. And what does that mean is that have we selected the appropriate patient population, the appropriate study design? Are the concepts being able to be captured in a reliable and valid way that we can interpret and we understand, and that we're still capturing what's things that are important to patients? And can we communicate this information in a way that is not misleading? And so we do have Code of Federal Regulations that define us on what we need for that to be well defined. Next slide. So the FDA has put out a methodological guidance series, and I will tell you, it is the only guidance series you probably will see from the FDA at this point. Next slide. And we were charged with putting together a methodological guidance series on how to collect information to support patient-focused drug development. And if you hear us talk about it, we talk about it as the PFDD guidance series. And there are 4 guidances that make up this series. And these series are meant to be used collectively together when we're looking at the use of developing clinical outcome assessments to support trial endpoints. And so the first guidance out there is on collecting comprehensive and representative input. It's really about how do we talk to patients? How do we collect information from them? The second guidance is on methods to sort of identify what is important to patients, and that starts to bring in more statistical and more rigorous study design methods of how do we actually capture that information in a way that can be informative and begin our conversation into guidance 3, which talks about, and guidance 3 is really where our conversation today is going to be on, which is selecting, developing, and modifying a fit-for-purpose clinical outcome assessment. And so we need to take this good information and go into guidance 3, which we're going to talk about. And finally, guidance 4, which is how do we take that clinical outcome assessment and really incorporate it into a clinical trial endpoint? And this goes more into statistical methods and approaches to take. And so that will not be the scope of today's conversation, but can be a scope of future conversations of the statistical aspects that are needed when we're applying to COA development and endpoints use and interpretation. Next slide, please. I also want to quickly highlight that in our ALS guidance that came out in 2019, we do talk about the use of new outcome measures that are capable of measuring clinically meaningful effects in patients. And so we do, in our effectiveness endpoint section, really talk about that. We are very much open to this conversation of instruments that collect the broad range and lived experience of patients with ALS. And so I do want to say that, we've been very much open to this and willing to have those conversations with sponsors who want to incorporate these clinical outcome assessments into their trials. Next slide. And so really what we hope the goal of this effort that we're doing is, one, to follow the roadmap to patient-focused drug development as described in guidance 3. So we really want to say, hey, we put this out and we're following our pathway that we know that works to be able to do this effort. And we want to focus on clinical outcome assessments that are going to be fit for purpose and can support our clinical trial endpoints. And with those that hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate efficacy, and then we'll be able to make a positive regulatory decision. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Cheryl Kuhn from the Critical Path Institute to describe the effort that is taken so far.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. There we go. So now I want to provide you with an update on the work that has been done on the literature review to identify concepts and measures. I know you've all been wondering about the progress on this project since it was announced last year, and we didn't want to come to you too soon. Rather than coming to you with a blank slate and expecting you to fill in all the blanks for us, we've been doing our due diligence so that, as Dr. Baracchio said, we can establish a common baseline to allow for constructive engagement with you. Next slide, please. The research question for this project was targeted. How do we get to fit for purpose clinical outcome assessment tools that are meaningful to people with lived experience? For this project, we are specifically looking for tools that would support clinical trial endpoints, which means we need to meet regulatory statute for that. To answer that question, we had a series of goals. First, we needed to identify the concepts of interest that are meaningful to people with lived experience. Second, we wanted to identify the clinical outcome assessment tools that measured those concepts. And third, we needed to determine if any further development of those tools might be needed before they would be ready to be used in supporting endpoints in clinical trials for ALS. Next slide. To meet these project goals, we undertook the following project activities. First, a targeted literature review was conducted to serve as a landscape analysis to better understand concepts important to people with lived experience. This literature review considered patient and caregiver perspectives, natural history of the disease, and other expert input as sourced from published literature. Second, the findings from this landscape analysis were used to identify the most relevant concepts of interest to be measured in clinical trials of medical products under development in ALS. Third, knowing what concepts are important, we could identify measurement tools that have been developed for or used in measuring outcomes of ALS. For the most promising measures that measure relevant concepts, a gap analysis is underway to see if sufficient evidence exists to support the measures used. Finally, that gap analysis will inform the fourth step, which is to make recommendations on using existing tools in their current state, on modifying existing tools to make them better, or on developing new tools where they don't currently exist. Next slide. Dr. Campbell spoke about the patient-focused drug development roadmap that paves the way to fit-for-purpose tools. This project is specifically addressing the need to understand the condition, the need to determine how clinical benefits will be defined, and it will get us about halfway down this route for selecting which measures to use. After we complete the fourth activity, we'll know which area to follow to get us to fit-for-purpose tools. And I should mention, when we look at this roadmap, it looks very linear, but there's a lot of going back and forth between these different categories, these buckets within the roadmap. And I'll reflect back on that at the last slide. Let's go to the next slide, please. We've taken a number of steps to support the project activities, starting with a search that produced 437 publications. The abstracts of those publications were reviewed, and the list was reduced to 88 based on their relevance to the specific research topic here. Those 88 full-text articles were carefully reviewed, with information being extracted from them and tabulated for consideration. They produced a list of 176 descriptive concepts that were regarding patient-centered health experiences. And they were grouped then into 20 overarching domains that I'll show. The full text review also identified 112 clinical outcome assessment tools that have been used in this type of research. We've identified the top 10 tools that seem to have been well-developed and measure relevant concepts. And the gap analysis, as I mentioned, is currently ongoing. When it's completed, we'll make recommendations on how to fill any of those identified gaps to support the use of the tools in clinical trials. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the 176 descriptive concepts that were identified through this literature search were grouped into 20 overarching domains, which you will see here. These domains span a wide range of patient experiences, from physical symptoms to functioning to personal impacts. This is a very comprehensive list that paints a broad picture of the experience of people with ALS. The concepts listed here are all meaningful, every single one of them. We want to see these things improve or remain stable on a new therapy. However, we can't assess if a new therapy is working based on everything on this list. Next slide. Instead, based on what Dr. Campbell shared earlier about how FDA reviews evidence provided in clinical trials, we need to narrow the list to the concepts that might be useful for supporting clinical trial study endpoints. This list is narrower here and focuses on things like symptoms, physical functioning, and functional impacts. The concepts on this list are easier to connect the dot between how people feel and function and how a new therapy might actually work in action. Next slide. That list of concepts looks different from the list of things that are less likely to support clinical trial study endpoints. Again, these things are all meaningful, and they are things we'd love to see improved on a new therapy. However, these things are more removed from the way in which a drug would work on the body, and there might be other things that could be impacting them. For example, taking a new therapy could improve a person's financial situation because they are able to work, because they're able to function better physically or cognitively. But that economic impact is a step or two removed from the thing that the drug is directly impacting. So in a clinical trial, it would be more powerful statistically and easier to interpret if we focus instead on the things that are closer to how the drug works. These things could still be measured in a clinical trial or in other types of studies, but because the work for this project is specifically focused on clinical trial endpoints, we excluded the things on this slide from further consideration. Next slide, please. So now that we've identified an initial list of relevant concepts, we were able to proceed with identifying a list of relevant tools. We found 112 measures in the literature search, but only 23 of these were specifically developed for use in ALS populations. Now, it's certainly possible to take a tool that was developed for a different population and adapt it for use in a new population. But it's easier if the original work was done in the population of interest, because you'll know that the concepts it measures are going to be relevant and the items are going to be worded appropriately. So we have a long list of measures to consider, but the best candidates that we identified in that list of 112 are listed here on this slide. You may see some that you're familiar with, and you'll notice that the well-known ALS FRS is not listed here. And that was intentional. That's because we decided to focus on measures beyond the ALS FRS, because people have already spent a lot of time researching that instrument. And a lot of the stuff that we're looking for is already known for that one. Next slide. So from there, we identified a subgroup of measures that seemed valuable for further consideration. We chose the tools on this list if they measured relevant concepts and if they were developed based on qualitative work with people with lived experience. We also considered tools that were on the list of measures being used by all ALS, or if they were on the NINDS Common Data Elements list. We excluded tools from this list if they were developed for screening purposes, which would mean that they would be less sensitive to change over time. If they included too many items, which can be burdensome in a clinical trial situation. If they didn't include enough items to measure the concept in a specific way. If their scope of the measurement was too narrow to where it only covered a small subdomain. And if the concepts being measured were on the list of those that are unlikely to support the clinical trial study endpoints. Remember, some of these excluded measures may be valuable and relevant in other research settings. We were choosing this list specifically with regulatory evidence requirements in mind. Next slide. After we narrowed the list to the measures that were based on that described criteria, we checked them against the all ALS list and decided to add the Center for Neurological Study Lability Scale because it measures a relevant concept that didn't appear to be measured by other tools, and qualitative research with people with lived experience was used to develop those items. I'll note on this list that digital health technologies, which includes wearables and other sensor-based tools, are not currently included, but we recognize that these digital tools could be useful and will certainly be further explored in a separate work stream. Next slide. So where are we? Currently, the gap analysis is underway on those 10 selected tools. Once the gaps are identified, we will determine what activities are needed to fill those gaps. Potential activities that might be needed include individual interviews with people with lived experience to confirm that the concepts measured by the tool are relevant, important, and written in a way that's easily understood. Or we might need to do psychometric analysis to confirm that scores produced by the tools are reliable, valid, sensitive to change, and interpretable. Click, please. Before we proceed with filling those gaps, we want to know that we're on the right track, which means engaging with you, the experts on this topic. So next slide. let's go back to that patient-focused drug development guidance and pinpoint where we need your help in the process. When we look at what we produce through activities 1 and 2, we want to know from you if we identified the right concepts to be considered for measuring clinically relevant outcomes in clinical trials. Remember, we're focused on the type of outcomes that would meet regulatory statutes. So when you go back to that list of concepts in the yellow boxes, let us know if there are things that are missing from that list and why those things are important to you. You might also find things on that list that just aren't relevant for you or are less relevant than other things. And that would be good for us to know. Those boxes, like I said, they are 20 concepts that are big containers for all those little nuances that came across in the literature. So you might end up providing feedback that we already have embedded within those boxes, but it would still be really helpful just to confirm that we are on the right track with that. The other place where we need your help today is determining if we identify the right tools to measure those relevant concepts. You might know of questionnaires that you've seen in studies you've participated in, or studies that you've helped plan yourself. If you have come across any questionnaires that were good for measuring the things that are important to you, let us know. And perhaps you know of some tools in the table of selected measures. If there are any that made our list of 10 that you just don't like because of what the question asks or how they are asked, that would be good for us to know as well. So like I said on this slide, this seems like a linear process and we are proceeding along that pathway, but we're going to go back to those earlier chapters and just pressure test and make sure that we are on the correct pathway, because the step after this is picking which arrow to follow. We want to make sure that we follow the right arrow so that we can get to fit for purpose COAs at the end of this roadmap. I should also note that when we think about the big picture here, a fit for purpose COA is just one piece of an endpoint. The endpoint includes how often things are measured, what time period that we're looking across when we're thinking about has improvement happened, and then also how we're going to statistically analyze the data that come out of clinical trials. And those are all really important things for us to think about. But if we don't do the work well here on the forefront, what we do on the back end when we get to the endpoints discussion, we'll have sort of error going into that. We want to minimize that by doing the right things here, picking the right concepts, picking the right tools. And you can click, and I will hand it back to Tom. I do hope that this overview of the process we're following and our project goals has been helpful. And Tom, take it away.
Great, thank you so much.